All right, I thought I'd just make a little video on this, maybe some tips and tricks on this welder. I did notice a comment that a guy said, I bought one of these, man, I don't like it, it sucks, blah, blah, blah. And I really think that it's got to be a settings issue. And I'm just going to go over some of the things that I've learned after using this for about 6 months now. And I really like the welder. I've had no problems, really. I did have to return one because the wand uh, it actually failed. So it does have some, it's a $350 welder, on a coupon. It's 400 bucks if you go in. No, you can't use a 20% off to buy it. You have to get the specific coupon for the 140 volt item. There is an app that you can download on your phone that you can find the latest coupons on that, and you can actually scan stuff in the store. It's really cool. And maybe, I don't know if I can get a link in there for that, but just look up on your phone Harbor Freight coupon app and you'll find it. It's there pretty easily. So let's talk about some of the things that might be an issue for some people, but really it's actually just a settings or issue with how that you're doing something. I do find that the settings on here, all the stuff on here is a little bit cold for me, and the wire is a little bit too slow. Now that's just kind of me, that's not necessarily that the specs on here are wrong, but it gives you kind of a little bit of a baseline. So let's give an instance. I use a lot of 20 gauge. I'm welding 20 gauge steel. Okay, and it says to run it at, and I'm using 025 wire. It says to run at, you can probably see it better through here, 14.5. Now, I run at about 15.1 when I'm lapping. If I was butting, that might be okay. I might be 14.8 or something like that. And then my wire speed is usually, I don't know what the number is, but it's usually between 4 and 5. So I think they have theirs a lot lower than that. So try this. Try turning up your wire speed. Turn up the heat a little bit from what you're seeing on the thing. Turn up the wire speed a little bit from what they recommend until you get that, the sound of the weld, the right way. Because it'll be like really quiet, almost kind of weird, eerily quiet on their settings. And it does weld okay. I've done it that way. But, you'll find that that's one of the issues. And there's a couple others. And, if you're used to like a regular 220 welder, you might find some little bit of different stuff. If you've used a crappy 110 welder, this is such an upgrade from that. You probably will be like, oh my God, I can actually weld with this. I've used the other crappy thing, and man, I could barely weld with that, but this thing I can weld with. So if you're comparing this to a 220 welder, it is a different experience. That's all I can tell you. It's not, and believe me, I use this. Look, I have my 150 bottle on here. I don't have my 150 on my 220 welder. I use this mostly because it works better for sheet metal, and once you get used to it. So a couple of things, the induction thing and stuff like that. Some people think, oh, well, that's confusing. And I learned a little bit of this stuff from my subscribers that actually were commenting, and I highly suggest reading some of the comments and going in and liking them as well. But go look at this in the induction knob and kind of how it works. I don't know if I got this backwards or forwards or whatnot, but I think if it's on 1, it makes a really small puddle. If it's on 10, it makes a really big puddle. So when you're welding most things, I have it on around 5. But if I'm trying to keep a really tight puddle, then I can put it down to 1 or 2, and it'll make a really small weld, and then you got to change your wire settings a little bit. So you might have to lower your wire speed and lower the heat just a little bit, and to try and get that to work in your benefit. But if you're welding thicker stuff, it's kind of nice when you turn it up. You can turn it up to 10 or whatever, and it actually makes a nice bigger puddle. And when I was welding stuff like this frame here, I had the induction turned up a bit. So another thing, the induction knob can be a little bit confusing, but it actually can be a benefit to you if you're trying to use that. But if you just put it at about 5 and you just don't touch it, usually it'll work okay. You know, you're not going to change. You know, it's going to be kind of like a regular welder. Um, the other thing I found on it is that tip sizes, and you know, okay, so let's say I have my 220 welder and I put a 030 tip in and I'm welding with 025 wire, it'll just work. You know, on the 220 welder, it just doesn't care. As long as the wire goes through the hole, usually it'll just work. This thing, you've got to have the right tip in there. So if you've got 025 wire, you got to have an 025 tip. And what it is I think it's because the electronics in it and it's DC. It doesn't, it'll start doing some weird stuff where it'll kind of spit the wire, and it'll act like it's so what'll happen is it's getting a bad connection between the wire and the tip, and so it has to have the right one. And if it's worn out at all, it'll start to spit the wire. So and you know, that is something that I noticed on this thing. So keep a lot of tips. You look at how many tips I have in here. I bought, you know, I buy them by like 100, you know, and just change them. And sometimes I'm changing them even though the wire still goes through it. But it's the orifice has opened up enough to where it's not getting the proper connection there, and it's what it's doing is kind of burning off the wire in the wrong place. So I don't know. It'll if the tip's too large, what it does is it wants to burn off the wire further back, and then it won't actually, you know, work into the puddle. So if you're having that issue, that's probably what it is. So the other thing I'm finding on this thing is, of course, this one is very fragile. It is very cheaply made. I did find a place that you can actually get an upgraded one. I don't know if it's any better, but they do sell them. Somebody does, and if anybody posts a link that there is another one that will fit in the hole that has a similar connector, or one you can just do some changes to, that'd be nice to know. And so that you could upgrade that. You really have to, just like any, sorry about the noise, you have to be, with any MIG welder, you have to make sure that this thing is pretty straight, okay? If you're trying to weld something and you have this thing kinked really sharp, you're going to have issues with the wire spitting. It's not going to flow correctly. And this is pretty much MIG welding 101 as far as that goes. Try and keep this thing straight. Don't let it get twisted, okay? If it's twisted and it's tight, twisted like that, it's not going to want to weld correctly. So those are little things that you might have issues with that are really not the welder. It's just something you need to change up a little bit in what you're doing. Harbor Freight does not sponsor me at all. I'm just making this video because I know other people are having the same issue or problems. And maybe it's just, you know, maybe it's your first welder. And I found out a lot of people are buying this as maybe their first welder, and maybe they've never really welded much, and they think that it's a welder that's wrong. It's actually just some things you need to kind of change up a little bit. I have not used any of the flux core. So flux core questions, I've just read some comments. Some guys say that the thing welds amazing on flux core compared to some of the older or the basic welder, not the inverter style or the titanium, but the other, like 125 from Harbor Freight. It's supposed to weld a lot better with flux core. I'd never done it. I won't because there's really no need to. I have gas, and I would highly recommend using gas. You know, on gas, this thing welds really clean. Another thing I did notice on it is when you set up your gas, you should be running at 15. I think I don't know if that's pounds or flow, but you should be running it at about 15. Okay, you can run this at as low as about 12, but what you'll find out is when you put a new bottle on, and towards the end of the bottle, you constantly, every time you turn it on, you have to check your gas flow. So pull the trigger once, make sure it's at 15, or if you're running it at 12, that's up to you. But 15 is the standard. You're supposed to run it at. I'm not telling you to run it at 12, but if you were going to do that to try and save a little bit of money, that's up to you. But if you run it at 15, you have to pull the trigger every time and make sure that that thing, while the trigger's pulled, goes down to 15, because you'll find that the gas flow fluctuates on this thing. So when I put a new bottle on, by the time I go from a new bottle all the way to the end, I've had to adjust this thing 10 or 15 times. So make sure that you're constantly, every time you go to use it, pull the trigger. Because I've had other people say, man, I waste a bunch of gas. It goes through gas like crazy because of the way it keeps running afterwards. Well, really what's happening is your gas, as your bottle gets lower and lower, your gas pressure starts to go up. So I found that I've had to lower it and lower it and lower it, lower it. And then when I put a new bottle on, it actually won't even work at all. And then I have to readjust it and start with, a totally different setting. So constantly look at that, because you'll be wasting gas like crazy at you'll be blowing it at 25 pounds when you're supposed to have it at 15, and you'll just go through bottles like crazy. You're like, wow, I use so many bottles of gas. It's because you got to constantly check that setting. For some reason, it keeps changing. I don't know if it's the regulator. Maybe there's a way to upgrade that, put a flow type system on it, but I don't know. Maybe that's the issue. But I do find that with my other welder, I've never had to, it doesn't even have an adjustment for the gas. It's weird. It just is just set up for whatever, and I've never had to adjust it. I'll show you. See, all it does here is have the pounds for how much gas is in it, but there's no adjustment there to change the flow rate or anything. So I never knew how to do that until I got this one. And I've been welding with this thing for like 35 years, so no big thing. And this isn't the welding channel. We're not sitting there putting stuff on tables trying to show you how perfect I can make it look. This is reality. What I do here on my YouTube channel is actually, make stuff, build cars. So, and I've been doing that for years, and my welding's always held up. I've never ever had a weld crack or fail ever from anything I've ever done. So, but I'm not here to try and show you how pretty I can make stuff look. That's not what this is about. It's just about some issues you might have with your Harbor Freight welder, and things that you just need to make some changes on what you're doing. I'm not saying the welder, I think, is fantastic, but the user, maybe you just don't know, you haven't used it enough, or maybe you just started welding and maybe you need a little bit of help trying to figure it out. So try turning up the heat a little bit from the settings. That's what I've been doing. Turn up the wire speed a little bit from what the settings show. It's a good baseline. You can kind of use that and then just start there. So for instance, I'm just going to go over some of the settings I use. For 20 gauge, I'm usually between 4 and 5. I don't know exactly where on the wire speed. I just turn it up till it starts to sound right. And then and I'm using 0.025 wire, and I'm at 15 on the heat, 15.1 somewhere, and I try and usually be in there at 15.3 sometimes. Usually if it starts to get much higher than that, I'll start burning holes on 20 gauge steel when I'm lapping. If I'm butting that, I'll turn it down to maybe 14.8 or something like that. So that's the settings show like 14.5. So they are a little cold to me. Okay, the next thing, so if I'm welding, this is 16 gauge. So if I'm doing this 16 gauge tubing, I've been welding that at 16, and I think I have the wire towards 5, right around 5, I think is what my setting was for that. So if you're welding, if you're doing wrought iron fences or something like that, that might be kind of a baseline to start. And again, that's going to be up to you, your speed, and I'm using the inductance at 5. Sometimes I'll turn it up to 6 or 7 when I'm welding that, if I want to have a really big weld or more of a larger puddle. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. Okay, so those are some of the settings I'm using. I'm trying to think of 18 gauge steel. I'm at about between, I can weld it at 15.1, but I'll turn it up usually to about 15.8, something like that. This is 18 gauge. Some of the issues I have with this is if I'm using rust converter, okay, I need to remove that because it won't weld through it. You gotta grind it off, you know, wherever you're welding. If you're using rust converter, that might be an issue you're having. If you're using that, you got to remove that rust converter. For some reason, it just doesn't like it. Some of the things that I can find also on this welder that I can't do on this welder that I can do on my 220 is with my 220 welder, I can turn the heat up. Okay, I can just crank up the heat and I can burn through paint and stuff like that. You're not going to be able to, most 110 welders, you're not going to be able to do that. It will burn through a little bit of rust. So if you take a wire brush and clean the surface, like if you're just using one of these here and you're going to clean the surface with that, it will weld through that pretty well. Where if you do that with the old 125, you know, the cheap welder, the, what is it called, the Chicago electric welder, it's not going to want to weld through. It has to be very, very, very clean with that. With this one, you can just clean it with a wire brush and you can still weld through it. But just trying to get through paint or something like that, it doesn't really want to do that very well. So and like I said, that's pretty typical with most 110 welders that you're going to get. Even, you know, as far as I know, even the Miller 211, you might have issues with that as well. So any inverter welder. So anyway, those are a couple of things that, you know, maybe, you know, things to change up. You know, maybe try changing it up a little bit, and try cleaning your metal. You know, if you're having issues, you know, try cleaning the metal up a little bit and try it. You know, sometimes I'll be welding something and I didn't clean it very good, and I'll start to weld it. It'll get a little poppy, and I'll grind it real clean, and it'll weld just beautiful. So, you know, a lot of times that's the issue. You know, so sometimes it likes clean metal, sometimes it doesn't care. But definitely, when I'm doing something like this stuff, it really doesn't like that rust converter. It won't burn through it. The other welder, the 220 welder, I could just turn the heat up and I could spot it real quick, burn it a little bit, and then just go back and hit it again, and it would burn right through it. And then I could just stay ahead of it, and it would just weld through it. But, you know, again, I'm burning through a lot of stuff with that. This thing, I'm able to control the heat a lot more and be able to weld sheet metal and make it look pretty good compared to the 220 welder, which would just burn a lot of holes. So anyway, those are a couple little tips. Hope to help. Make those comments, and if you are a person who's having no issues, maybe put down some of the comments on things that you've learned from using it, and that might help some of the people. And I would suggest also people who are watching the video, I know it's kind of long, a lot of talking, just go down and read those comments. Maybe it'll help you. Hopefully I've covered everything. I'll talk to you in the next one. Please like, share, and subscribe.